On 11 December 1940, Hitler issued Führer Directive 21, an order for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The German military plan called for an advance up to the hypothetical line running from the port of Arkhangelsk in northern Russia to the port of Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea, the so-called AA line. This would bring the bulk of Soviet population and its economic potential under German control. Franz Halder, Chief of Staff of Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, alongside many other generals, began planning the operation. Halder's plan was based on the experiences of Fall Weiss, Fall Gelb and Fall Rot, German invasions of Poland, Low Countries and France respectively. The plan was rather simple. German forces were organized into 3 army groups with different strategic objectives. The Army Group North was commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Reichen von Lepp. Its main goal was the city of Leningrad, former capital of Russian Empire and the main Soviet naval base in the Baltic Sea. The Army Group Center was commanded by famous German commander Fyodor von Bock. The Army Group Center consisted of 2 Panzer armies instead of 1, as in case of other army groups. The main strategic objective of this army group was the capital of the Soviet Union, Moscow. The last army group was the Army Group South. Actually, it was the most important group to Hitler because her goals were of the greatest strategic importance to the Reich. This army group was supposed to take Ukraine and the city of Rostov and later advance towards the Caucasus, taking the oil fields of Maikop and Grozny. This army group was commanded by the Gerd von Rudenstedt. The plan of actual operation created by Hadler looked like this. Firstly, the Luftwaffe will take the Soviet Air Force by surprise, destroying most of the Soviet aircrafts when they are still on the airfields. Secondly, the German Wehrmacht alongside its Romanian and Hungarian allies will cross the border, taking the Soviet forces by surprise, outmaneuvering them and creating the encirclements. In the region of Lithuania, in case of Army Group North, near the city of Białystok and Brest in the operational regions of Army Group Center, and finally near the city of Przemysl and Lwów in case of Army Group South. Then the unmotorized units will take care of hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers trapped in the pockets, while the Panzer Group A units will advance forward to the cities of Riga, Minsk and later Smolensk and cities of Zhytomyr and later Kiev. Then, the unmotorized units will catch up with Panzer Group A and proceed to continue the offensive, creating new pockets out of Soviet reserves. Finally, the Axis forces will clean the remaining pockets and advance towards their strategic objectives, with little resistance from the Red Army, maybe with the exception of cities of Moscow and Leningrad, since at this point Hadler accepted the Red Army to effectively collapse. Hitler was even more optimistic about Soviet Union's situation than Hadler, stating that you only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure, Soviet Union, will collapse. After a 5-week delay while operations in Greece and Yugoslavia were completed, Operation Barbarossa, named after the all-conquering medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I, was launched on 22 June 1941. Over 3.5 million German and other Axis troops attacked along a 1,800-mile front. A total of 148 divisions, 80% of the German army, were committed to the enterprise. 17 panzer divisions, formed into 4 panzer groups, formed the vanguard with 3,400 tanks. They were supported by 2,700 aircraft of the Luftwaffe. It was the largest invasion force to date. The Soviets had massed large forces on the western frontier, but they were under orders not to provoke the Germans. Although mistrustful of Hitler, Stalin did not believe that he would attack so soon. Despite the ominous German build-up and a stream of intelligence warnings, he had some 5 million men unable immediately and a total of 23,000 tanks, but the Red Army was still unprepared when the Germans struck. The Germans got off to a good start. with the panzer groups quickly pushing towards their objectives and Russian forces falling apart in confusion. They were greatly helped by the Luftwaffe's bombing of Soviet airfields, artillery positions and troop concentrations. The Germans quickly established air superiority. On the first day alone, 1,800 Soviet aircraft were destroyed, most of them on the ground. Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lipp plunged towards Leningrad with General Irish Hoppenan's Panzer Group 4 in the lead. Russian forces in this sector were thinly spread and the panzers covered 500 miles, 804 kilometers, in 3 weeks. By mid-July, they were only 60 miles, 96 kilometers, from their objectives. Army Group Center under Field Marshal Fyodor von Bock also made rapid progress. By 28 June, Panzer Group 2, led by General Heinz Guderian, and General Hermann Hoff's Panzer Group Dry had encircled 3 Russian armies and captured over 320,000 men in the Białystok-Minsk pockets. The 2 panzer groups then pressed ahead, linking up on the far side of Smolensk on 27th July in another double involvement. 2 more Russian armies were trapped and destroyed, and another 300,000 troops taken prisoner. Army Group South under Field Marshal Gerald von Rudenstedt had the furthest to go, and his attack also faced the stiffest Soviet resistance. Most of the Russian armor was on this front, but by early July, von Rudenstedt had pushed out beyond the pre-1939 Polish frontier. General Ewald von Kleist's Panzer Group 1 was slowed by Soviet flanking attacks. As it headed for Kiev, the capital of Ukraine and key to the coal-rich Donetsk basins, on the 8th August the Germans surrounded 2 Soviet armies, capturing 100,000 men in the Uman pocket and reached the Dnieper River. The naval port of Odessa on the Black Sea was also besieged. Up to this point, all seemed to be going well. The only major problem being the time needed for the infantry to catch up with the panzers and mop up pockets of Russian defense. Or at least that's what Haller thought. In reality, a far more dangerous problem started to affect the Wehrmacht. The German logistical situation started to look grim at best. The German army at the beginning of Barbarossa had a logistical branch that wasn't built up in a planned, organized fashion. It was scrunched up. A division could have 100 different types of trucks in their logistical arm. All Germans' manufacturing facilities were directed to production of weapons before and during the war. Motor vehicles for civilian use were severely restricted. Private use of motor vehicles was even forbidden during the war. So all unbuilt motor vehicles were requisitioned by the German army. And not only in Germany, also the countries they had conquered previous to Barbarossa. So they had trucks from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, France, Belgium, Denmark and Norway. You can imagine the poor mechanics task with maintaining that fleet of trucks. Manuals in Czech, inscriptions on parts in Norwegian and French, etc. And the part supply for all of those different models of trucks was probably non-existent, nor was it produced. Furthermore, Germany was so squeezed for oil during the war that much of supply was still running on horse and mule and donkey-drawn carts. Those animals needed to be fed, taken care of, and they were slow. An additional problem for German logistics was that, when they crossed the border of the Soviet Union, the rail gauge changed. Soviet rail tracks were just a little bit wider, so German trains could not run on them. German engineers had to modify the entire rail system, and they could only do that at about 10 km per day pace. So, whenever divisions advanced faster than that, their supplies couldn't reach them by rail, so they had to fall back to trucks and animal-drawn vehicles. All those things out together make for a very poor logistical situation. To make the matters even worse for Germans, the already desperate oil situation became even more dire. In 1941, Axis oil production amounted to only 326 million gallons, a significant deficit in the light of 456 million gallons used for the year. As a result, Luftwaffe fuel reserves fell dramatically from 219 million gallons in January 1941 down to 91 million by December. The Luftwaffe alongside the Heer had absolute priority in terms of fuel. Edward Wagner, the most important quartermaster general during Operation Barbarossa, had come to tragic conclusions in August of 1941. With the current rate of consumption, the Wehrmacht will effectively run out of fuel to sustain any big offensive operations of more than one army group by October. Hitler was aware of the severity of the oil situation by all accounts. If I don't get the oil of Maikop and Grozny, then I must finish this war. Hitler was aware of the severity of oil shortage long before planning for Operation Fall Blau. In fact, the Axis oil deficit was the main reason why Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in the first place. That's why Hitler was of the opinion that the Army Group South was of the highest priority. But Halder was of the opinion that the key to victory was taking Moscow. Thus, because he was de facto the actual commander of the operation on the strategic scale, Halder deprived the Army Group South to strengthen the Army Group Center. Firstly, he assigned additional Panzer Group of General Heinz Guderian to the Army Group Center instead of Army Group South. Secondly, he deprived both the Army Group North and South of additional reinforcements and fuel, giving priority to Army Group Center. As a result, the Army Group Center was able to advance faster and easier than other army groups. Halder, in this way, wanted to show Hitler that Moscow was an easy target, and convince him to give the capital of the USSR priority. However, his decisions effectively bogged down the Army Group South near Kiev, where the biggest concentration of Soviet forces decided to take a stand. Hitler, after learning of Handler's scheming, was furious and felt betrayed by his generals. He personally ordered the transfer of the 2nd Panzer Group to the south after 29th Motorized Division captured Smolensk on 16 July. Many argued that transferring the 2nd Panzer Group was a mistake and that the Germans should have advanced to Moscow instead. The example of person who supported this idea may be Heinz Guderian, the commander of the 2nd Panzer Group himself. However, in my opinion, such a move would be a huge mistake that could have cost the Axis the war as early as 1941. The Smolensk fell on 16 July. However, cleanup actions against Soviet forces trapped in the pockets in the region ended in early August 1941. Logistical situation of the Army Group Center was a complete mess. Without the conversion of Soviet railways and establishment of supply depots, as well as replacing German losses, the continuation of the offensive would be impossible. If the Germans would decide to give absolute priority, the Army Group Center would be ready for the continuation of the offensive towards Moscow in mid-August in the best case scenario. When the German forces would try to advance, their flanks would be exposed to Soviet counterattacks from both south and north. The main bulk of Soviet forces in the Ukraine wouldn't be destroyed in the Kiev pocket, and the Soviet forces would be able to transfer a significant part of their finest forces from the south. If the Soviet forces would succeed in their counterattack, the entire bulk of Axis advance in the region would be encircled. Even if Germans would withhold the Soviet counterattacks, their forces would probably suffer heavy losses and would be slowed down. Germans then could, realistically speaking, take Vyazma and Bryansk and encircle part of the Soviet army, just as they did during early stages of Operation Typhoon. However, after taking Vyazma and Bryansk, Germans would have to stop their advance to let their non-motorized infantry units catch up, as well as replenish their material losses. This means that Germans would be ready for the advance towards Moscow from Vyazma in mid-September. At this point, Russian Rasputnitsa had already started. The roads had changed to an uncrossable sea of mud. Motor vehicles were effectively paralyzed, and even the tanks and half-tracks vehicles had trouble operating. This would not only terribly slow down German forces, but also lead to effective collapse of German logistics, just as it did during Operation Typhoon. The exhausted German forces would probably arrive at the gates of Moscow in mid-October, facing fierce Soviet resistance. But there is a problem. In mid-October, German forces ran out of fuel, which alongside the Russian General Matt and the collapse of German logistics, makes both Panzer Gruppe's operations severely crippled. Germans are incapable of encircling Moscow and are vulnerable to Soviet armored counterattacks. Luftwaffe support is severely limited due to the lack of aviation fuel and the bad weather. So, the only option left for the Germans is the direct urban assault of Moscow. This battle would have proven to be a total bloodshed for both sides. Even if the battle by some miracle would not have turned to slow and painful urban fighting, similar to that of Stalingrad, and Germans would have successfully taken the city, this doesn't mean that the Soviet Union will surrender. To quote the Secretary of Defense before the Battle of Moscow, "If we lose Moscow, it will surely be a great disappointment, but it by no means disrupts our grand strategy." Marshal of the Soviet Union, Simon Timoshenko. Basically, taking Moscow would not have ended the war. So, Germans are stuck in Moscow, without any supplies and functional panzer force. In November, Russian winter begins, and Soviets muster their forces for winter counteroffensive, just as in our timeline. With one notable difference. Their forces are much stronger. The counter-offensive forces would be reinforced with all of the surviving Soviet forces that would have been destroyed in the Kiev pocket. Germans are unable to hold, of course, so they have two options. The first one is to flee the city. This one is terrible for German forces, as at this point any heavy equipment would be lost and thousands of soldiers would die from hunger and cold. It would be basically the repeat of Napoleon's campaign in Russia. The second option is to stand and hold the Russian counteroffensive. I believe Hitler would have chosen that one and issue stand fast orders just as in our timeline. But without operational heavy equipment, ammunition or even food, there is no way the Army Group Center could withhold the might of the Red Army. Luftwaffe efforts would be limited because of bad weather and German forces would slowly start to lose ground. In December, the Soviets would have retaken Moscow and gone on a full offensive with Siberian reinforcements. The Army Group Center would have to face the Soviet attempt to fully encircle the entire army group. There is no way that at this point German soldiers could withhold. Entire Army Group Center would have been encircled in similar manner to that of Damien's Pocket in our timeline, except that on a much larger scale. Just as in the case of the Damien's Pockets, Luftwaffe would try to supply encircled German soldiers, but because of the small size of the pocket, those attempts would fail. Germans would probably try to launch counteroffensive to break from the pocket, but the forces inside it would have at this point possessed little to no combat abilities, and German reserves outside would have been insufficient to counterattack, considering the lack of free panzer divisions and the fact that both Army Group South and North would be bogged down in their respective operational zones. All of this means one thing. Army Group Center is lost in early 1942, and war is de facto lost too. Real life is not a Hearts of Iron game. You cannot ignore such factors as logistics and weather. With that in mind, I think we can agree that turning the 2nd Panzer Group south was a right decision. Yet, despite this right decision from Hitler's side, Operation Barbarossa had clearly failed. Despite the serious losses inflicted on the Red Army and extensive territorial gains, the mission to completely destroy Soviet fighting forces and force a capitulation was not achieved. One of the most important reasons for this was poor strategic planning. The Germans had no satisfactory long-term plan for the invasion. They mistakenly assumed that the campaign would be a short one, and that the Soviets would give in after suffering the shock of massive initial defeats. Hitler had assured the High Command that "we have only to kick in the front door and the whole edifice will come tumbling down." But Russia was not France. The shock value of the initial blitzkrieg was dissipated by the vast distances, logistical difficulties, and Soviet troop numbers, all of which caused additional losses of German forces which could not be sustained. One factor is however still missing: the Abwehr. The German intelligence service, under the command of Wilhelm Canaris, did everything in its power to make sure that the invasion would fail. The Canaris was a secret resistance supporter and was actively supporting the Allies throughout the entire war with valuable intel. His involvement in 1944 Operation Valkyrie, the cap and assassination attempt on Hitler, finally got him shot, but the damage he had already done to the Third Reich cannot be described. Abwehr intentionally underestimated Soviet forces. By how much? The Abwehr estimated the number of tanks in Red Army possession at around 8,000. The Soviets, in reality, had 23,106 tanks. Not to mention the fact that Abwehr claimed that Soviets do not possess modern medium and heavy tanks, while in reality Soviet T-34 and KV-1 heavy tanks were, according to Germans themselves, better than any Panzer in German possession at the time. The following was true for almost every aspect of Soviet armed forces and the Soviet Union's mobilization capabilities. They were vastly underestimated and led OKV to false conclusions. If I had known that the figures for the Russian tank strength which you gave in your book were in fact the true ones, I would not, I believe, have ever started this war. Considering that even Hitler himself realized that Barbarossa was probably a lost cause, as early as August 1941, I think we can agree that in some sense Operation Barbarossa was doomed to fail from the start. The vastness of Soviet Union had proven to be an obstacle too great to overcome for German logistical capabilities, and Soviet forces withheld the initial blow that was supposed to knock them down. As such, the Axis invasion of Soviet Union was a risky gambit that failed, because it simply couldn't work in such circumstances. Yet despite all of this, Germans performed brilliantly on the Eastern Front, achieving great victories that far surpassed their own capabilities, fighting a furious, often numerous, and contrary to popular myths, quite decently equipped enemy. Thank you for your dear time, viewer. You can like and subscribe to make Duce feel proud. If you disagree with me, tell me why. I am always open for discussion. Also, all references are in description. See you next time.